marriage used to feel inevitable. But now, men over 40 are quietly walking away. Not out of bitterness, not out of fear, but because they've done the math, it no longer adds up. When companionship is everywhere, when expectations have shifted, and when the risks outweigh the rewards, the smart move isn't, "I do," anymore. It's, "I don't." If this speaks to you, comment below. I didn't say I do, and I don't regret it. 1. Intimacy is everywhere. Commitment lost its leverage. There was a time when the promise of physical and emotional closeness was rare, sacred, something that could only be accessed through a meaningful commitment. Marriage served as the gatekeeper. It was the bridge between attraction and shared life, the structure that made intimacy possible and culturally acceptable. But today, that equation has fundamentally changed. The rise of casual dating culture, mobile apps that facilitate instant connections, and a society that increasingly normalizes short-term encounters means that for the average man, physical intimacy is no longer tied to commitment at all. In the past, marriage wasn't simply about companionship or legal recognition. It was one of the few socially acceptable paths to closeness. This scarcity gave marriage leverage. It gave men a clear incentive to propose, to build, to invest emotionally and materially. Now, that scarcity is gone. Intimacy is no longer a reward for commitment. It is often available without significant investment. This shift fundamentally alters the incentive structure. Why would a man invest in a lifelong partnership when one of the key motivations, the promise of exclusive connection, is freely available in other ways? Many men look around and ask, logically, if I can experience companionship, physical affection, and social connection without the obligations of marriage, why should I sign a contract that exposes me to legal, financial, and emotional risks? It's not cynicism, it's a rational analysis. The modern world has flooded the market with opportunities for connection, whether real or superficial, reducing the perceived value of any one relationship. This is simple economics. When supply increases dramatically, demand and thus value naturally decline. And this is what we're seeing today. Men are no longer pursuing marriage as an entry point to intimacy. In fact, for many men, marriage seems to offer diminishing returns. The freedom to connect with others easily without the financial, legal, or emotional burdens of traditional marriage means that the question has shifted from, who should I marry? To, do I even need to marry at all? And for a growing number of men, the answer is becoming clearer. No, I don't. This doesn't mean men have lost interest in women or in closeness itself. It means that marriage no longer holds the unique position it once did as the gateway to those things. In a world where abundance reduces exclusivity, where availability removes the need for long-term commitment, marriage has lost one of its core sources of leverage, and men, especially those paying attention, are responding accordingly. 2. The mismatch of expectations, hyper-selectivity. In today's dating landscape, an undeniable pattern has emerged. A growing gap between what women expect and what many men are willing or even able to provide. Cultural narratives have encouraged women to seek upward mobility in relationships. This isn't inherently wrong, but it creates what some call hypergamy, the desire to marry up, choosing a partner perceived as more successful, wealthier, or of higher status than themselves. In decades past, the average man could reasonably expect to find a partner who valued shared growth, teamwork, and complementary roles. But today, many women, driven by modern ideals of empowerment and independence, are simultaneously told they deserve the best, while narrowing their definition of what the best looks like. For many women, the best now means a partner who earns significantly more, who is emotionally intelligent, successful, physically attractive, and socially high value, all at once. But here's the problem. The men who fit this description represent a small minority. These high-status men, often in the top 10% in terms of income or social desirability, are fully aware of their position, and crucially, they face no pressure to commit. They have options, freedom, and access. Why would they settle down when the incentives aren't compelling? Meanwhile, the majority of men, average, hard-working, responsible men, find themselves overlooked. Not because they lack value, but because cultural standards have shifted upward in a way that makes them invisible. This creates what economists would call a market mismatch. On one side, A large pool of women all vying for a small segment of men at the top. On the other side, average men left asking, where do I fit in this picture? Many women may believe they are simply holding out for what they deserve. But from the male perspective, this hyper-selectivity feels like rejection, unfair standards, and an unwinnable game. And for high-status men, they have no reason to choose commitment when abundance gives them freedom without responsibility. This mismatch fuels frustration on both sides. Women wonder, where are all the good men? And men quietly opting out, recognizing they aren't being evaluated as individuals, but as a checklist of traits that few can match. The result? A relationship market that increasingly favors a few, while leaving many feeling excluded or disillusioned. And this isn't just happening in elite circles. Across all socioeconomic levels, this shift is reshaping how men perceive marriage itself. When many women view relationships as an opportunity to secure a lifestyle upgrade, and when high-status men see commitment as unnecessary, the middle-average men seeking partnership get squeezed out. This leaves more and more men asking a simple question: why should I participate in a system where my effort won't even be noticed, much less valued? For these men, walking away isn't about bitterness. It's about clarity. They aren't saying, I don't, out of spite. They're saying, I don't, because they finally understand that today's expectations often exceed what's reasonable or fair, and because they recognize their peace and self-respect matter more. 3. The career paradox. For decades, society rightly encouraged women to pursue education, financial independence, and professional success. This progress was long overdue, and no reasonable person questions the value of equal opportunity. But when it comes to relationships and marriage, this shift has created an unintended paradox. Many modern women, particularly those who are highly educated and career-driven, still desire marriage, but they often seek partners whose success surpasses their own, a phenomenon rooted in hypergamy. For example, a successful attorney, corporate executive, or entrepreneur in her 30s may be looking for a man who not only matches, but exceeds her achievements in income, status, and education. Here's the catch. The very men who meet these elevated standards, typically older, established, and financially secure, often no longer view marriage as an attractive proposition. Why? Because the benefits these career-oriented women believe they offer, education, income, independence, don't necessarily translate into value in the eyes of such men. A man who is already successful doesn't need a partner for financial security. He has his own income, property, and autonomy. For many of these men, adding a spouse who brings competing priorities, career ambitions, or additional household complexity can feel more like an emotional and logistical burden than a benefit. This is the paradox. Career women believe their accomplishments will make them more attractive partners, but for many men, especially those with established success, it doesn't enhance appeal in a marital context. In fact, some men view it as a signal of future conflict, too demanding careers, competing schedules, and an increased likelihood of disagreements about roles, child-rearing, and household management. Even average men who are less successful may hesitate to commit in these situations. They may feel intimidated or fear that they will not be respected as equals. For men who highly value peace and simplicity, this perceived complexity can lead them to quietly withdraw from the marriage market altogether. This isn't about diminishing women's achievements. It's about recognizing a fundamental shift in incentives. The traditional appeal of marriage partnership, shared goals, complementary roles, has eroded in a landscape where both partners are expected to prioritize demanding careers. And the men who see this paradox most clearly are increasingly asking themselves, if she has her own income, career, independence, and I have mine, why marry? Many conclude that marriage doesn't add value to their lives. Instead, it introduces potential complications without offering clear rewards. This quiet calculation leads a growing number of men, especially those with experience or hard-won stability, to say, I don't. Not because they fear commitment, but because the career-driven relationship model offers them no peace, no simplicity, and no clear upside. The career paradox isn't a critique of women's success. It's an observation of how that success, combined with rising expectations, has fundamentally altered how many men now view the institution of marriage. 4. High-status men have no incentive. Among the men who are opting out of marriage, one group stands out clearly: High-status men, those who are successful, financially secure, and independent, are increasingly the least motivated to marry. Why? At first glance, this seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't a man who has it all seek a partner to share that life with? But here's what many overlook. For these men, the traditional reasons to marry have faded or disappeared entirely. In earlier generations, marriage offered men emotional support, stability, a caretaker at home, and a socially sanctioned path to build a family. In exchange, men provided financial security and leadership. But today's high-status man already has all the external markers of success without needing a spouse. He has his own home, staff to maintain it, the freedom to travel, and the ability to build a lifestyle perfectly suited to his preferences. He doesn't need marriage to access companionship or emotional connection. He can meet people easily and on his own terms. Financially, he is secure. Legally, he understands the risks. Marriage introduces exposure to asset division, spousal support obligations, and the complexity of dissolving a legal partnership that no longer serves either party. Even when children are a desire, modern options such as surrogacy and co-parenting arrangements offer alternatives to traditional marriage. In short, the high-status man recognizes that marriage no longer guarantees what it once did, but still comes with substantial potential costs. He weighs the equation carefully. Emotional peace. Marriage may introduce emotional turbulence, competing agendas, or friction over lifestyle choices. Financial risk. Divorce settlements can threaten wealth he has worked decades to accumulate. Freedom. Marriage can require constant negotiation of time, attention, and energy compromises he may no longer find appealing. Given this, many high-status men simply ask themselves, what does marriage offer me that I don't already have or can't create on my own? And increasingly, the answer is, nothing essential. This is not about bitterness or cynicism. It's a rational decision based on lived experience and clear-headed analysis. These men don't view women negatively. They simply no longer view marriage as an attractive vehicle for building a life. The traditional contract, security and provision in exchange for companionship and care, has evolved in ways that no longer align with their reality. In today's world, where high-status men can enjoy flexibility, autonomy, and companionship without the constraints of marriage, the incentive to formalize a union through legal vows has largely evaporated. This is why we see an increasing number of successful, confident, high-status men quietly saying, no thanks. Not out of fear, not out of immaturity, but out of clarity about the cost-benefit imbalance they now perceive. And unless the cultural landscape shifts dramatically, this trend is unlikely to reverse anytime soon. 5. Emotional burden and conflict. Marriage has traditionally been seen as a partnership, a bond where both individuals provide support, stability, and shared purpose. But for many modern men, the emotional landscape of marriage has become more complex, less predictable, and increasingly demanding. In the past, traditional gender roles, while imperfect, at least provided structure. Expectations were clear, responsibilities were delineated, and emotional exchanges followed relatively familiar patterns. Today's cultural shift has changed that dynamic. Modern relationships often require emotional labor that many men feel ill-equipped or unwilling to provide. This isn't about coldness or lack of empathy. It's about the sheer volume and intensity of emotional expectations placed on them. Men are now being asked not only to provide financial stability, but also to serve as emotional confidants, partners in therapeutic conversations, and sources of constant validation. For some, this feels overwhelming. These evolving demands often come without a reciprocal understanding of the male emotional experience. Men who seek simplicity, peace, and clarity find themselves navigating increasingly complicated emotional terrain, conflict resolution styles, communication theories, and high expectations for emotional availability. Add to this the fact that many men feel they cannot express vulnerability without judgment or misunderstanding, and the result is frustration. Even when a marriage begins with good intentions, this imbalance can escalate over time. Arguments become more frequent. Tension builds around mismatched emotional needs. And slowly, what was intended to be a peaceful partnership begins to resemble an emotional battlefield. For a man seeking peace after a long workday, this dynamic is particularly discouraging. He may ask himself, why should I enter a relationship where I feel blamed for falling short of expectations that keep changing. The allure of marriage as a safe emotional harbor has, for many men, faded. Instead, it is often perceived as a source of new stress, additional emotional labor to perform on top of daily responsibilities. It's important to note this isn't about blaming women. The pressures on modern women are significant too: work demands, societal expectations, and their own internal struggles. But from the perspective of many men, marriage no longer feels like a refuge. It feels like a place where peace is elusive, emotional complexity is high, and where their own emotional needs are rarely acknowledged or met. The result? A quiet decision to step away, not in anger, but in recognition of an emerging reality. The emotional burden and potential conflict embedded in many modern marriages outweighs the peace and support that marriage was once expected to provide. And so, many men, especially those who value simplicity and stability, are concluding, if peace is what I seek, I'm more likely to find it outside of marriage. 6. Financial imbalance. Marriage, for much of history, was as much a financial arrangement as an emotional one. It was understood that both parties brought value. Men traditionally offered income and protection. Women offered domestic stability, child-rearing, and partnership. Today, this dynamic has changed dramatically. Modern women are more financially independent than ever, a positive cultural development. Yet paradoxically, the expectations around financial responsibility in marriage have not shifted equally. Many men observe that despite a woman's own income, there remains an unspoken and sometimes overt expectation that they will bear the greater financial burden. This imbalance becomes even more pronounced when the possibility of divorce is considered. In the event of separation, courts often award spousal support, child support, and asset division in ways that can leave men with significant, long-term financial obligations regardless of circumstances during the marriage. To the modern man evaluating this landscape, the message is clear. Marriage represents substantial financial risk, with uncertain reward. He asks himself key questions. If my partner is financially independent, why is it still assumed that I will pay for most shared expenses? Why would I willingly expose my hard-earned assets to legal jeopardy if the relationship fails? These aren't cynical questions. They're logical calculations. Even when love is genuine, a man entering marriage today must navigate a complex web of financial expectations: expensive weddings, lifestyle inflation, housing costs, vacations, and education expenses for children, all set against the backdrop of an economy where job security is far from guaranteed. And should the relationship break down, he faces an additional layer of financial vulnerability. Alimony, child support, and asset division can leave men paying large portions of their income for years after separation. This isn't about being anti-marriage. It's about recognizing that the traditional deal marriage once represented pooled resources. Shared effort often feels lopsided now. When a man looks around and sees these patterns repeatedly, friends and colleagues drained financially by divorce settlements, custody battles, or spousal support obligations, it reinforces caution. Many conclude that the financial cost of failure is too high, while the financial benefit of success has declined. After all, if both partners work, if both partners earn, and if both partners are independent, why is it still presumed that the man must carry the greater financial load? Without a clear answer, many men step back. Their decision isn't driven by hostility, but by prudence. They understand that marriage today brings significant financial exposure, but fewer guarantees of balance, stability, or fairness. So they ask themselves, if financial independence is the new norm for both genders, why enter an arrangement where I take on disproportionate risk? And increasingly, their quiet response is, "I won't." This financial imbalance, subtle but powerful, is yet another reason why many thoughtful, responsible men are choosing to say, "I don't," rather than "I do." 7. A return to primal dynamics. Beneath the surface of today's relationship landscape, an ancient pattern is quietly re-emerging, a return to what some call primal mating dynamics. In modern society, we often assume that relationships and marriage are widely accessible to most people willing to commit. But if we look closely at the current dating environment, a different reality appears. Today, a small percentage of highly desirable men, those who are wealthier, more attractive, higher status, attract the majority of female attention. Meanwhile, The vast majority of average men find themselves sidelined, not because they lack value as individuals, but because the cultural environment now enables and amplifies this hyper-selectivity. This pattern mirrors what anthropologists have long observed in early human societies. A few dominant males attract multiple partners, while most other males are left without access to long-term mates. In other words, the relationship market is beginning to look less like a modern, equitable system, and more like an unstructured environment where opportunity is unequally distributed. The dismantling of traditional norms, some of which encouraged monogamy, family formation, and partnership, has unintentionally revived this ancient imbalance. Dating apps, social media, and shifting social expectations allow top-tier men to engage in serial relationships or avoid commitment altogether, while many women compete for this small subset of men. Average men, observing this shift, are increasingly asking themselves hard questions. If most women now seek the same small group of men, where does that leave me? Why should I participate in a system where I am effectively invisible? For many, the answer is simple. They choose to step away not out of resentment, but because they recognize the game is no longer fair, or even designed with them in mind. This quiet exit contributes to the broader trend. Men saying, "I don't," not just to one woman but to an entire cultural script that no longer reflects mutual benefit. Even top-tier men, the small group who win in this environment, often avoid marriage altogether because they recognize that their freedom offers greater rewards than formal commitment. In effect, we're seeing a reversion to a primal structure. A few men with abundant options and little incentive to settle down, and many other men who simply opt out, recognizing their efforts won't be reciprocated. This dynamic isn't healthy for individuals or society. It leads to increased isolation for many men, frustration among women seeking long-term partners, and an erosion of the shared cultural scripts that once promoted stability. Yet this is the reality many men perceive today. Faced with an environment that increasingly favors the few while marginalizing the many, more and more men are concluding that marriage, and sometimes even dating itself, is not worth their time, energy, or emotional investment. They aren't angry, they're clear-eyed, and their response is a quiet but resolute, "I don't." At first glance, it might seem like men are simply afraid of commitment, but look closer. This isn't about fear. It's about calculation. Today's man evaluates marriage not as a default, but as a deal. And increasingly, that deal looks one-sided. The benefits once attached to marriage, companionship, stability, intimacy, respect, are now accessible without vows. The costs, financial, emotional, legal, remain high. The cultural narratives that once supported commitment have eroded. So men make a quiet, but powerful decision. I won't play a game that no longer serves me. This doesn't mean they hate women. It doesn't mean they've given up on love. It means they're finally clear-eyed about what marriage has become, and they're choosing to protect their peace, freedom, and hard-earned stability. If you recognize this truth, leave a comment below. I didn't say I do, and I don't regret it. Because today more men than ever aren't just saying "I don't" to one woman. They're saying "I don't" to an entire cultural script that no longer makes sense.